guys, so this lesson is going to be about how to reharmonize a song. Now, I've touched on this in a previous lesson about how to turn a song into a jazz song. So this video is going to repeat some of that same content, but then it's also going to go a bit further. So if I'm moving a little bit too fast for you here, go watch that video first where I go over a lot of the basics in some detail. So reharmonization is essentially just chord substitution, but for an entire chord progression rather than just for individual chords. It's used to make a song more jazzy, that is more harmonically and more structurally complex, and also to personalize a song and make it your own. So it's almost like composing a brand new song or creating a variation of an existing song. So generally speaking, a song consists of a melody and a chord progression. Now obviously there are exceptions, like many modal jazz tunes don't necessarily have a strict chord progression, or John Cage's 4 minutes 33 seconds doesn't have a melody or a chord progression, but I'm talking just generally here. Though I would love to see somebody reharmonize 433. So reharmonization essentially just involves changing the melody or changing the chords, or both. But the changes you make should be based around certain ideas or certain rules, which I'll be going over in this video. So to reharmonize a song, you really need to take two things into account: the harmony and the structure. So the harmony is the interaction between the melody and the chords, and it depends on the quality of the chord, that is whether a chord is major, minor, dominant, diminished, etc. And your goal here is to make the melody note an acceptable harmony over the chord. Now I'll go over this in detail in a moment, and I'll also go through an example at the end of this video to make this clearer. Now the structure depends on the movement of the chords and the bass line, and is not affected by the quality of the chord. Now your goal here is that the chords and the bass line should both move in a logical, structured manner. And essentially what that means is that they should both move in fixed intervals, diatonically, or somehow reflecting the melody. And again, I'll go over this in a bit more detail in a moment. So then your overarching goal when reharmonizing a song is to change the chords and or the melody to ensure that the melody is an acceptable harmony over the chord, and that the chords and the bass line move in a structured way. Now the first step of reharmonizing a song is taking that song and going through bar by bar and finding the key melody note of each bar. Now the key melody note is harmonically the main note or the most important note in a bar, with all the other notes assumed to be or treated as passing notes, so notes that aren't harmonically important. Now choosing the key melody note is largely subjective, but the types of things you should be looking for are the longest note in the bar, the first note in the bar, and any repeated notes in the bar. Now in a particular song, there could be more than one key melody note in a single bar, in which case you really should account for both of them. Or you can break that bar down even further and look at key melody notes for each half bar. Now there may not be a clear or obvious key melody note for a particular bar, like if for example you just have a quick run of notes. It might be difficult to determine, which one is more harmonically important than any other note in that bar. So in this situation, you should look at all or most of the notes in the bar and see what kind of chord or key they imply. And also in this particular situation, the structure becomes more important than the harmony. And I'll have more to say on this towards the end of this video. Now, as our example, let's take the first 8 bars of My Funny Valentine. Now that goes like this. Now I've circled what I think is the key melody note for each bar up here in the picture-in-picture. But essentially I've picked either the longest note in a bar or any note that's repeated in a bar. So for example, in bar 1 I've picked the C because it's the longest. In bar 2, I've picked the D because it's repeated. And so on, as you can see up here. Now the first thing I'm going to deal with is the harmony. So if you wanted to reharmonize that song, you could change the chord, both the tonality and the quality of the chord. That is both the tonic, whether it's C, D or E major, and the quality, that is the type of chord that it is, a major, a minor, or a diminished chord or whatever. So you could change the chord or the key melody note itself, but you have to ensure that the key melody note is an acceptable harmony over the chord. So then let's talk about acceptable harmonies. Now there are generally considered to be acceptable harmonies or available tensions for each chord type. That is, there are certain extensions or alterations which are acceptable, and there are others which are considered unacceptable. Now, acceptable harmonies are believed to complement the quality or the consonance or the sound of the chord, whereas unacceptable harmonies are believed to clash or ruin the quality or consonance or sound of the chord. So I've essentially categorized all 12 notes over a particular chord as creating either a weak, a strong, a jazzy, or an unacceptable harmony. So the root and the natural fifth are always considered weak harmonies because they don't contribute anything to the quality of the chord. The third, the seventh, and any altered fifth, that is a flat 5 or a sharp 5, are considered a strong harmony because they determine the quality of the chord, again, whether it's major, minor, dominant, or so on. And then certain extensions and alterations are considered jazzy over a particular chord type, and other extensions and alterations are considered unacceptable. Now I'm not going to go through all of them in detail here, but you can see them up here in the picture-in-picture. And I also have a link below in the description to a Google Doc which will give you a summary of all the different acceptable and unacceptable harmonies for each different chord type. So for example, over a C major 7, the 1 and the 5 are considered a weak harmony, the 3 and the 7 are considered a strong harmony, and then the 9, the sharp 11 and the 13 are considered jazzy harmonies or available tensions, whereas all the other notes are considered unacceptable harmonies. Similarly, over a C minor 7, you've got the 1 and the 5 which are weak, the flat 3 and the flat 7 which are strong, and then the 9, 11 and 13 which are considered jazzy harmonies, with all the rest being unacceptable harmonies. And so up here in the picture-in-picture and in the link down in the description, I've listed a whole bunch of chord types, including dominant chords and suspended chords and minor major 7 chords and augmented chords and half diminished chords and full diminished chords, and essentially gone through every single note in an octave, all 12 notes, and listed them as either an acceptable harmony, and therefore colored green, or an unacceptable harmony, and therefore colored red. So you can check that out, like I said, both up here and in the description. But essentially, when reharmonizing a song, you can change the chord tonality, the chord quality, or the key melody note, but you have to make sure that the key melody note is an acceptable harmony over the chord. So for example, in bar 1 of My Funny Valentine, the key melody note is C, and the chord is C minor. So this means that the key melody note is the root of the chord that we're playing, and so considered a weak harmony. Now ordinarily, this would be a bad chord to choose over the key melody note of C. But in this particular case, it works well because the structure of the chord progression is very solid and logical, and so it actually works quite well. But again, I'll touch on the structure of chord progressions in a moment. But essentially, when reharmonizing a song, you can pick any chord where the key melody note, that is the C, forms an acceptable harmony over the chord. Like for example, D minor 7, where the C, the key melody note, is the flat 7th of the chord, and therefore a strong harmony. So tick. Or for example, B7, where the C is a flat 9 over this chord, which again is an acceptable harmony over a dominant chord. So tick, that's also fine. However, you couldn't use the chord D major 7 because that C would be an unacceptable harmony over this chord. That is, it's a flat 7th, whereas the D major 7th chord has a natural 7th. However, if you really wanted to use the chord D major 7, what you could do in this instant is, instead of changing the chord to suit the key melody note, you can change the key melody note to suit the chord. So instead of having C as your key melody note, you could change that to, for example, C sharp, which is the 7th of the chord and therefore a strong harmony. And so that's perfectly acceptable. You can change either the chord or the key melody note to ensure that the key melody note forms an acceptable harmony over the chord. Now I'm going to go through an example of a reharmonization of My Funny Valentine at the end of this video, where I put this into practice, so you'll see exactly what I mean. Now next, let's talk about the structure of the chord progression. Now your goal here is to move from one chord to the next in a structured way, and make sure that the bass line is also moving in a structured way, ignoring the quality of the chord. That is, whether the chord is major, minor, whatever, doesn't matter from a structural point of view. It of course does matter from a harmonic point of view when we take account of the harmony, but when we're discussing the structure, you don't need to worry about the quality of the chord. Now let's deal with the chords first. Now when I say you want the chords to move in a structured, logical way, essentially that means they should move either in fixed intervals, diatonically, or somehow be based around the melody. So when I say the chords should move in fixed intervals, that means they can move by any interval you like, whether it's half steps, or whole steps or tones, or minor thirds, or major thirds, which is kind of the idea behind Coltrane changes, or in perfect fourths or perfect fifths, which is just going through the cycle of fifths, just either ascending or descending, or moving in tritones, or any interval whatsoever, as long as it's a fixed interval, and therefore creates some kind of sort of structure or pattern. And I've written that up here in the picture-in-picture, so you can pause and have a look if you like. But again, keep in mind that the quality of the chord doesn't matter. And in all of these instances, I'm playing descending, but you could also ascend in fixed intervals. Now when I say you could also move diatonically, that also means essentially in fixed intervals, but only sticking to the notes of a scale. So for example, in the key of C major, the tonic of each chord would only be the notes from C major, the white notes. So you could go F7 to E7 to D7 to C major 7. Or you could go down in thirds and do something like B7, G7, E7 to C7. And in that way, I've kind of traced out the C major 7th chord. And so that's a bit different than going down in fixed intervals, because I've gone down by a major third, then a minor third, and then a major third again, which created its own little pattern, but it works because you're moving down diatonically. Or another thing you could do is structure the chords around the melody. So if the melody, for example, went C, E, F, your chords could be something like A minor 7, C major 7, D flat major 7, so that each of the melody notes is the third of each of the chords. Or you could go in the opposite direction and play something like A minor 7, F major 7 to E7. And again, that kind of mirrors the melody, because I've gone up a third, whereas in the chords I've gone down a third. Then I've gone up a semitone and I've gone down a semitone in the chords. Or you could move the chords in some other logical, structured way that creates some sort of pattern, and therefore gives the whole chord progression some kind of structure and logic. Now, I've been playing all the above chords in root position, but you should also take account of the bass line and make sure that the bass line also moves in a structured and logical way. So you can change the inversions to create a smoother bass line that doesn't jump around quite as much. And so moving the bass line follows the same structural rules. It can move in fixed intervals, diatonically, or somehow based around the melody. In a sense, kind of harmonizing the melody. And your bass line and your chords can move in different ways as long as they are both structured. So for example, you could do something called pedal point, where the bass note stays the same, but the chords change. So you could, for example, do E flat 6 to D7 to D flat major 7 to C major 7. Right, so the chords are descending chromatically, which is nice and structured, and the bass note is staying the same the whole time, which is also nice and structured. And in that way, you get a nice little chord progression. Or another thing you can do is move the chords through the cycle of fifths, but changing inversion so that the bass note moves down by steps. So you could go E minor 7 to A7, D minor 7 to G7, down to C major 7. And so the chords are going through the cycle of fifths, and the bass note is just going E, E, D, D, C, C. Alright, so now let's use these ideas I covered, both harmony and structure, to reharmonize the first 8 bars of My Funny Valentine. Now, if you wanted to, you could reharmonize it as follows. Right, so that sounds quite nice, and so I've written what I played, my little reharmonization, up here in the picture-in-picture. So dealing with the chords first, I started on an E half diminished chord, then I went down in a structured way, so going to the E flat major 7, to the D7, D flat 7, to the C minor 7. Then I went up a fifth to the G minor 7, and down a major third to the E flat minor 7. So in that way I kind of moved diatonically. I created a little bit of a minor triad here, going C, G, E flat. And then I just did a 2-5, went down the semitone and did another 2-5. So all the chords move in a very structured way. Similarly, the bass line moved in a very structured way. It didn't really jump around too much. So that takes care of the structure. That is, the chords and the bass line both move in a structured way. In terms of harmony, I picked chords where the key melody note of each bar created an acceptable harmony over the chord that I was playing. So over the E half diminished, the key melody note of C is a flat 13, which is an acceptable harmony. Over the E flat major, the D is a 7th, which is again an acceptable harmony. Over the D7, the C is the 7th, again an acceptable harmony. Over the D flat 7, the D is a flat 9th, so again is an acceptable harmony over a dominant chord. Now the next one's a bit different. I went down to the C minor 7, and the key melody note is C, which is the tonic, and it's technically a weak harmony. But in this case it worked quite well, because even though I have a weak harmony, I have a very strong structure. That is, the chords and the bass line were just moving down chromatically, so the next sort of implied chord after the D flat 7 is the C minor 7. So we're playing a very structured chord progression, heading down in semitones until we hit the tonic chord, the C minor 7. And so even though the harmony is a little bit weak because I'm playing the root of the chord, the fact that we have a really strong structure makes up for that. And then so on through the rest of the chord progression. I played the third of the G minor 7, and then the F, which is the key melody note of the last 2 bars, is the 9th, 13th, 3rd and 7th of the little chord progression, the 2-5-2-5 that I went through. So I applied all of the ideas that I just covered into this reharmonization. That is, all the harmonies were acceptable harmonies, and the chord progression and the bass line were quite structured. Now let's take this a bit further and do a slightly more interesting reharmonization. And to do this, let's find the key melody note of each half bar and then change chords every half bar as well. And so you'll see what I'm about to play up here in the picture-in-picture, so try to follow along. So as you can see, this time I changed chords every half bar, so I broke down My Funny Valentine into half bar segments and found the key melody note of each half bar. But as you can see, I followed the same general principles. So I started on C minor 7, then I went through a series of keys in a structured way. So I went from the C minor 7 upper fourth to the F, and then I went down a minor third to the D, and then down another minor third to the B. And I preceded each of those sort of tonic chords with a 5, with the dominant chord. So I went C minor 7, then C7 to F, then A7 to D, then F sharp 7 to B. So I'm changing keys in a structured way, and I'm kind of doing a 5-1-5-1 pattern with each new key, which incidentally is kind of the idea behind Coltrane changes as well. Then the bass line is also quite structured and moves quite smoothly. And similarly, the key melody note of each half bar forms an acceptable harmony over each of the chords that I played. However, if you notice bar 3, I played a D major 7. Now the original key melody note at the beginning of bar 3 is a C, which would be an unacceptable harmony over this chord. And so I changed the key melody note to a C sharp, and therefore making it an acceptable harmony over this chord. So again, that's just to show you that when you're reharmonizing a song, you can change both the chords and the melody in your reharmonization. Now in bars 5 and 6, I based the chord progression around the melody, so that the top note of each chord kind of doubles the melody an octave lower. So I went... Right, so playing the chords by themselves, you hear quite clearly that I'm doubling the melody an octave lower using the sort of the soprano voice of each chord voicing. And also at the end of bar 5, where the melody is E flat and I'm playing in F minor 7, the melody then jumps a fifth up to the B flat, so my chord also jumps a fifth to the C7. And that works well because the C7 is the dominant chord, the fifth of F minor 7. So in that way, the chord kind of reflects or mirrors the melody, and so it sounds quite nice and quite structured. And then again, the last two bars, just when I sustained the F in the right hand, I just went through a number of chords in my left hand. And incidentally, just as an aside, in bar 8, it looks like I'm playing two relatively complex chords, going from an E7 sus to a D flat 7 augmented. But really both of those are just disguised G7 chords, which is why they sound good, but that's not something we need to worry about in this particular video lesson. Cool, and I thought I'd finish with some rules and tips around how to get your reharmonization to sound really professional and really smooth and really pleasant. Now, the first tip is to choose chords and melody notes that increase and then decrease your tension. So to increase your tension, you want to pick notes that are sort of higher extensions and alterations, like flat 13s or sharp 9s. And then to decrease your tension, or to resolve your tension, you want to focus on the 3rd, the 7th, and maybe a natural 9th. So for example, over my first reharmonization of My Funny Valentine, I played a C over a E half diminished chord at the beginning, which is a flat 13, which creates a lot of tension. And then I resolved that by essentially moving to the E flat major chord, where the key melody note moves up to the 7th, which is a really smooth and low tension note. So I've gone from sort of a high tension to a low tension. So it's kind of a little bit of a resolution. And that's kind of what jazz and improvisation and reharmonization is all about, sort of playing with the tension, increasing and then decreasing the tension to get some interesting harmonies going, but then resolving those sort of tensions and harsh harmonies. Now the next tip is that over long melody notes and repeated melody notes, it sounds good if you change chords and therefore change harmonies over that melody note. Like for example, the last two bars of My Funny Valentine are just the note F for the whole bar. But instead of just picking one chord and playing that one chord with that one melody note for the whole two bars, which can sound a bit boring, I moved through a number of different chords, keeping that same melody note. Like for example, in the first reharmonization, I did something like this. And that sounds really smooth and really good and interesting and jazzy precisely because you're changing the harmony despite the melody note being the same. And that works just as well over repeated melody notes. Like for example, if the last two bars were just the note F repeated, you could have done something like. Now I've told you that when you reharmonize a song, ideally you want a strong acceptable harmony and a strong logical structure. However, you can have one without the other. You can choose a weak harmony, like a root or a fifth, if you have a strong structure, like descending two fives. Which is exactly what I did in my first reharmonization when I went to the note C over the chord C minor 7. Even though that's a weak harmony, because it was a structurally strong chord progression, it actually worked quite well. Similarly, you can have a weak structure with no apparent pattern if you have a strong harmony, so if your melody notes are, for example, thirds or sevenths. And that's exactly what I did in the second reharmonization when I did a little chord progression which followed the melody, or which mirrored the melody. Right, so structurally that wasn't the strongest chord progression in the world, because I was sort of jumping around by differing intervals and things like that. But because I had a very strong harmony where the chords mirrored the melody, creating quite a strong harmony, it again worked quite well. And finally, if you have a melody that is a really fast run of notes and so does not have any obvious key melody note around which you can structure your harmony, then the structure becomes more important than the harmony. Now this is the case in a lot of bebop era songs, where you have really fast melody runs that don't really have any obvious key melody note around which you can structure your harmony, but they countered that by having really strong, really grounded 2/5 based chord progressions. Right, so even though you might not have an obvious key melody note around which to structure your harmony, you can still get a really strong reharmonization by inserting a really strong structural chord progression. But of course, you want to take some note of the harmony, so you want to look at all the notes that are being used in the quick little runs to see what kind of key or chord they're implying, and maybe employ that in your left hand as well. But generally in this situation, structure becomes much more important than harmony. Now in this video, I've just been using seventh chords voiced as a block chord, which isn't especially jazzy. When you want to do a full or a proper reharmonization, one that you're going to perform or perfect, you really should use more jazzy chord voicings. Now I've got a completely separate video series on jazz chord voicings, so you can go check them out if you're interested. Now another thing you can do is to insert passing chords, which are chords that are not harmonically important. Now I've also got a separate video on passing chords, which you can view if that's something you're interested in as well. And finally, to top all of that off, you can embellish the melody a bit, which introduces some elements of improvisation on top of the basic melody that you're playing. And then so adding all of these concepts together, that is the reharmonization concepts of harmony and structure, as well as these other ones of passing chords and chord voicings and embellishment or improvisation, can give you a really strong and solid reharmonization. And almost, like I said, it's almost like composing a brand new song or creating a variation, your own personal variation on an existing song. So really, in reharmonization, you're applying all the same ideas and concepts you would when composing a brand new song from scratch. Cool, so that's all I wanted to cover. Hopefully that all made sense to you. If you missed any part of that, feel free to leave a question in the comments and I'll get back to you and try to clarify anything I may have sort of muddled up here or not explained to the full extent that I could have. But otherwise, thanks for watching and yeah, see you next time. Bye.